Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to wrap up today with a special selection, which is where one of you tell me exactly what it is I need to check out. Today's comes at us from Sean. A little bit of a content warning here. The song has sensitive topics including suicide, self-harm, depression, and alcoholism. Too Late to Call an Ambulance is a poignant and introspective song that delves into the aftermath of a tragic event. It conveys a sense of helplessness, regret, and acceptance in the face of a loss, while also alluding to the complexity of the person's inner struggles. Alright. Pretty heavy topics here. There's also something ironic about listening to this just after Filter's Hey Man, Nice Shot. As usual, I don't align any of this. I take the special selections as they come in, first out kind of cue, and the theme songs are done completely through polling on Patreon, so just have a day that's about suicide, I suppose. Both songs today. Real heavy stuff. Let's dive into this. I've never heard of Psychonaut 4 before. Let's just dive in, see what they're bringing to the table. Very interesting rhythmic pattern for the vocal line. Very strong core element in here as far as chord choices, vocal layering, and I'd even say the harsh style, though it does bleed into depressive black metal style of shrieks as well. interesting to hear the snare back off from the constant attack to this more measured idea of just using the double bass kicks. Even that rhythm right there on the bass kick and guitar is very core. And the marimba. I want to start with the objective first before we dive into some more subjective takes that I have on this. I think they do a great job at building intensity throughout the song. The beginning is, well, compared to the end, rather muted, kind of going for a less dense sound in general. There is the guitar, there is the drums, the bass, they're all present, but the vocals take up so much more space here, all three of them. We have the center vocal, the echo that comes in on the sides that just repeats what we had center, and then when those echoes are going, we also have a very low, sort of like gothic metal style of vocal delivery there that gives us harmonies on the echoes. Those instruments in here end up getting swallowed up by the music after we hit the halfway point, and we kind of reach the black metal section for a moment before that kind of lightens up a little bit, and we see some varying rhythmic ideas, but we'll get to that in a second. Anytime that we kind of get outside of this simpler idea, though, the instruments grow in size and in volume, and the vocals don't. They get swallowed up by the atmosphere. I think this is a very cool direction to take with something like this, as we have somebody who is, I don't know. We'll get to the lyrics, I suppose, in a second. I picked up very, very little of the lyrics, but I'm going to assume that it is somebody who has, I don't know, there's somebody dying around them, and their thing is, it's too late to call the ambulance, they're already dead. And so they're dealing with this grief, this trauma, and for the emotion to swallow up their words, I think is a very, to use sort of an awkward word here, it's a beautiful artistic rendition of what this moment must feel like to this person. to be completely overwhelmed with grief. I think that ends up working well. It also, I don't know if it's even intentional though. I already kind of felt some black metal ties at the beginning. I mentioned that the vocals kind of reminded me a little bit of depressive black metal shrieks. I'd even argue that while I think the chord progression and general rhythmic flow generally remind me of post-hardcore music, there's still an undeniable blackened element to the harmonic structure that definitely is showcased rhythmically and audibly by the end of the song. Not audibly, sonically, by the end of the song. The idea of the vocals getting swallowed up by the music is kind of a staple of lo-fi black metal. So again, it might not necessarily have been an artistic choice, but I tend to like to give the benefit of the doubt and want to believe that that was the reason why they did it. Either way, I think it absolutely works at delivering this feeling, and whether it's intentional or not, it is still my read on it. And I think it's interesting how we see a variation of this where the vocals start out clear and dominant and then get swallowed up and then find their footing again before being swallowed up for the rest of the track, almost as if they're finding some sort of clarity through this grief for a brief moment, only to lose it all again, to lose, command over their emotions, which is, that's an acceptable and even expected response for somebody in this situation, to kind of be overwhelmed by their emotional state. Yeah, I kind of expect that. I've never been in a situation, I've never had anyone I know be in that situation, but it's just, I can't imagine. I can't imagine a situation going any differently. It's got to be a traumatic moment. And so for the music to kind of go in that direction, I think it works well. I start thinking about the music though. There's a lot of parts in here where if I hadn't had the themes of the song explained to me prior to going in, which I totally appreciate, content warnings are very much appreciated for stuff like this. But if it wasn't for that, I don't think I would have had. I don't know that we necessarily would have dove into a side of the music that necessarily deals with those feelings. I would have caught on to the vocals being swallowed up by the music, but I don't know if I would have understood why. Because in particular, when I think of the emotional state of this song, when I think of the harmonic value of it, the atmosphere, the chord progression, it's not always grief. I think that there's a generally negative element to it, but it really isn't until the end when the not the glockenspiel, the marimba comes in, that I begin to feel an element of sorrow to this. There's definitely pain in the vocal delivery. I think that is absolutely delivered well to showcase somebody who is absolutely at the ends of their wits, and they're just in a lot of pain. The vocals deliver pain well, but musically it doesn't always feel painful. There's a darkness to it, sure, but pain, sorrow, grief, I don't know that I picked those up often enough. And there was certainly a point prior to getting to the black metal section where I was thinking, this is a rather light song for such a heavy topic. I find that to be interesting because it made me think about other post-hardcore songs, and trying to think about how atmosphere in some of my favorite moodier tracks, more somber tracks, is achieved primarily through chord progression more so than texture, because that's my little hang up here. And the more that I thought about it, I think it's an issue with extremity. y'all have shown me some of the heaviest, darkest, slowest moving, depressive music out there that it's kind of difficult for me to rein that in and really feel that extremity, right? How can a song feel sad when I know what really sad has felt like? And it's kind of tough to bring that back in, almost the same way that for a while there, I'd say around year 2 or 3 of the channel, I was having difficulty figuring out what heavy rock was and where the division between rock and metal is, because y'all had me in the deep end of metal for so long that the lightest of metal started to sound like rock to me. And I needed someone to break it down in a very analytical way so that I could begin to see where this line existed, just because I had been in the deep end for way too long and my perspective had been totally skewed. And I think that's what's happening here. Even now, I think back to some of my favorite post-hardcore songs that kind of have similar chord progressions to this. Again, this has some blackened elements even in the harmonic aspect. But I think of some songs that I know that are pretty mournful or somber. And I think about them now, I'm like, it probably could have went a little heavier in that, couldn't they have? And it's a shift of perspective. Y'all have ruined me with this. But yeah, I think that's what's going on here. I really do. When we get to the end of the track, it's harmonically the same, but it actually feels like it carries more of the weight. And I think it's a lot of it is the heaviness of the music. It's the constant snare hits coming in on every beat. It's the double bass kick. It's the loudness of the instruments. It's the repetition that eventually I was happy to hear kind of broke through when we found something else, but I'll get to that in a second. And so I actually had a tough time emotionally connecting with this song for a little bit, because so much of it is just chord progression. We don't have a lot of atmosphere at the beginning aside from the vocal delivery. And we kind of see a lot of atmosphere towards the end as we push towards this heavy weight. And we just had chords, and I was like, I don't know. It's, for a song about suicide, self-harm, depression, it's kind of light, isn't it? It isn't a light song, I don't think, but compared to where I've been, it kind of felt that way. And I found that to be an interesting thing, where perspective and experience, especially where you might be most recently, your recent headspace, can really alter the way you perceive art and music more specifically here. But I do think there is a darkness in the chords themselves. I think it might shine through a little bit more on a second playthrough as I engage with it more, knowing where it goes. But absolutely, when the marimba comes in at the end, it's just a simple melody line. There's not a lot of stuff going on there. In fact, I might even not call it a melody. It might be more of just an ostinato. Regardless, though, it pulls some of that moodiness out of the atmosphere and creates something a bit more somber. And to me, all that says is that it's there, I just wasn't hearing it. If the melody can pull that emotion out, it's there somewhere. And I'm kind of curious where other people felt on this chordally, if you felt that this matched the weight of the topics. Now, as I mentioned, about halfway through this, we enter into some really aggressive black metal adjacent playing. I was at first a little caught off guard. Like I said, I kind of had a hint of like blackened ideas in here, but I really didn't think it was going to go in this direction. And all I could think was, yep, the hidden black metal. You give me a song, you don't mention black metal anywhere, it doesn't start that way, and eventually you hit me with that black metal playing. But it lightens up, not in a way that I think loosens it up at all. It just gets away from the extremity of the sound. We continue to focus on a rather aggressive delivery. The guitars, they don't really let up too much. The drums, we lose that constant snare, but we still have the 16th note bass kicks going on. We still have the very aggressive, painful, harsh vocals on top of all this too. It's still very metal, but we bring in some rhythmic looseness. These little double hits that come in every once in a while, the guitars and snare are both in on this together. We kind of have this unification of rhythmic sound, and it dances around that really rigid, constant rhythm that we were getting originally. It creates an interesting syncopation, not one that I think is necessarily groovy or danceable or anything like that. It doesn't make me want to move my body too much, but it does create some rhythmic change in the song. And I think it's interesting because syncopation to me is so closely tied to groove. Usually when you start implementing syncopation, you're going to create something that I'm going to want to move my body to. And that doesn't happen here. It's syncopated in a way that almost feels a little disruptive without reaching like an avant-garde or experimental type of rhythm. In a sense, it's kind of anti-rhythm without being disruptive to the song. And I think that's interesting. It invokes the perception of change without drastically altering the sound at all, without having the song fall apart because rhythmically it's chaotic. It never reaches that point. It's just different. That could also be interpreted in a lot of different ways, and I think it's really going to depend on what kind of lyrics are going on there, of how I would want to interpret the idea of change being implemented into this song. Because when we reach the black metal part, yeah, that's a big change from the first half too, but to me that's a very easily interpretable change. That's the overwhelming state of emotion, of, grief or sorrow. But that rhythmic change is more subtle. I don't know what that would be. So I think overall they do a pretty good job of crafting something that feels pained, it feels sorrowful, it feels overwhelming. There are some eclectic choices within that didn't necessarily grab me on this first time listen, but I do think that the pieces are there. I really think it's me that didn't latch onto it as well as if I was more prepared for the sound they were aiming for. And that's going to kind of take me into this subjective angle here. I'll be honest, this is difficult to get into. I feel like our very first introduction to the song is these vocals. They are very high pitched, a little bit of rasp to them, a lot of what I would say is vibrato, but almost sounds like a quivering of the voice. I think this person does a great job. If they aren't actually crying right here, they're doing a great job of acting like they're crying while still focusing on pitch, still trying to create something that is musically interesting while delivering it as though they are in a weakened mental state. Or that they're being overwhelmed by their emotions. That might be a better way to put it. But it is a little over the top, overly theatric, and I do think that the echo, especially with that very heavy, quick vibrato, kind of comes off a little comical. It's absurdly sorrowful in a way that it feels overdone. Some performances can move you and bring you to tears just as much as the actor is crying themselves, and other times it feels too cheesy and you end up laughing at it, even though it's a sad scene. The latter of those descriptions is how I kind of felt about this at the beginning. Honestly, parts of me thinks that makes it feel more authentic. I don't know if you've ever seen anyone fully consumed by grief, but it's not something where you have a lot of control. If you try to talk through it, it's going to be awkward. It's not going to really sound like you. There's not a lot of control to it. You're trying to say something through sobbing and hyperventilation, and whatever pitch you end up getting out is whatever pitch you have. And if there's a wavering to your voice, a quivering to it, that's just you can't ignore it. That's the the chemicals going through your body, uh, adrenaline, probably at that point. It doesn't sound natural, and in any other situation, it would probably be comical. If you just start acting like that at a soccer game where, it's like a kid soccer game or something, it's going to be comical. It'll be absurd. And I think that this kind of sits in that line. It's a very fuzzy area of, is this too absurd? Is it too dramatic where it becomes comical? Or is it an accurate depiction of being completely overwhelmed by grief in the moment? And I think a lot of that is, I mean, it's subjective, right? Everyone's going to have a different relationship to it. But this also isn't the first time that I've had a little bit of a chuckle at depressive black metal vocals. They're definitely an acquired taste. And I do think it's rather difficult to pull it off in a way that is going to be widely accepted as a great example of acting like a human in grief, because you're also trying to put it to song form too, and that's just an extra layer on top of being a really good actor, is trying to make it listenable. And I think that's just a really tall order for really anybody. So I don't want to kind of say that this is wrong or a bad type of vocal delivery or anything like that, but I do think that it kind of straddles this line of being a really good depiction and also kind of being absurd. And there are certainly times when I felt it worked better. When we hit the very large, loud black metal-esque stuff and the vocals get swallowed, that really high-pitched, more traditional Fry scream, I think absolutely works at delivering this very pained feeling. I think when we have more of the clean vocals with the like shallow breaths and the heavy vibrato and the higher pitch, even falsetto stuff, sometimes that's effective and sometimes it's not. It feels cheesy, maybe would be a way. And I really think that it can pull me out of the song at times. And this is something I've levied at pretty much every depressive black metal track we've had on the channel that has chosen to go with more expressive, and I'd even say a bit more experimental, kind of bringing in a theater or acting side into it. It's a very fine line, and I think it's really easy to go past it and kind of go beyond. And I would say then that with this specific vocalist, I think the fact that they kind of straddle that line and sometimes they nail the feeling kind of puts them as the best depressive black metal vocalist I've heard. So that's kind of cool. But it is, if you saw me kind of crack a smile or have a little chuckle throughout the song, it was probably because of that. And it has nothing to do with like the thematic elements of the song. It's all vocal delivery. It's the way that the sounds are put together and how my suspension of disbelief, whatever the musical equivalent of that would be, kind of gets broken from time to time in this track because of the vocal delivery. And that's entirely subjective. That's on me. Someone else might hear this and the vocals bring them to tears. Someone else might hear this and immediately turn it off. They hate the vocals. So, everyone's going to have a different response to it. Been kind of putting this one off, but let's dive into the lyrics on this and see what's going on. All right. This is interesting. The entire perspective is of somebody who came into a room or a house of someone who recently committed suicide, most likely. It says he did not leave a note. He didn't even clean his room. The smell of you and alcohol and a peculiar smell of blood, describing the sense of this place. He says he lies on the floor, probably fell off the chair, and I immediately understood everything. Pale, even white, through slightly parted lips appeared his yellow teeth. I think that's an interesting line there because it showcases a lack of hygiene, which I think indicates, it could be substance abuse, but it could also be a lack of willpower. I mean, depression is pretty good at stopping you from doing basic routine stuff. So maybe the dude just never gets around to brushing his teeth. He's just too lazy, too lacking of energy. Lazy is the wrong word, I think. Finds it takes too much strength and energy to get out of bed to go do that, even though it's what most people would consider a simple task. Uh, Being depressed is like having this massive weight on you. Anything takes 10 times as much energy to do. He says it's all over. But for absolutely nothing, you circle him, trying to help. There's no need to shout, I have a headache because of your screams. He just got tired of being a bastard. And I think this is peculiar. We've shifted away from describing the scene to getting the subjective responses of our narrator. He figures this person's already dead, that there's nothing they can do. People are circling this person, trying to, I don't know, do CPR or wake them up or something. They're trying to bring him back in a sense, or maybe just trying to keep him alive. Maybe they don't know if he's dead or not. And our narrator says there's nothing you can do, so stop shouting. I already have a headache. And he makes this about them. And it's just like, wow. Wow. This person has people that they care about surrounding them, trying to make sure that they don't die. Or if they have died, trying to bring them back to whatever. And you're saying you have a headache? And then you have the audacity to call the other person, the person who just killed themselves, a bastard. That is a wild perspective for this narrator. It makes me wonder if there's anything else in the album that would kind of indicate why this line was put in here. It provides introspection into a person that I honestly didn't think mattered much. The subject of the story is certainly the deceased person, but for this brief moment, we get an insight into our narrator's mind, and he is just terrible. He then states, do not try to return to life. As if, speaking to a ghost, the deceased, maybe the soul of this person. If you can hear me, don't try to come back. It says that there's a huge cut on his arm. So I think that's the first time we get a clear idea that it was probably suicide. Because at the beginning, I actually didn't know that. He says he didn't leave a note, which, you can certainly try to take your life without leaving a note. But he says he didn't even clean his room. He says that he smelled of alcohol. Could have just been an accident. It isn't until here where it describes a cut on his arms, I'm like, oh, okay. Suicide kind of comes back into the picture. And then the song ends with repetition of repetition of repetition of too late to call an ambulance. It's all over with him. And again, even that kind of has a coldness to it. I think it's interesting that the lyrics are delivered in such a way of grief, of pain, of sorrow, when the lyrics themselves are so cold and apathetic. I don't understand that at all. The lyrics have painted a very different picture of our narrator than the vocal delivery and music did. I'm really curious about that perspective, why they chose to go that direction. Is this just a case of writing a song about depression and using this type of vocal delivery because maybe their favorite bands are depressive black metal bands and they were just emulating that? But from an artistic perspective, I feel it completely undermines and undercuts everything the song had going for it. And in fact, it kind of leans a little bit into that side, how I mentioned that the song doesn't really feel as melancholic as I was expecting, given the themes. And that actually does line up with our protagonist, well, not protagonist, with our narrator. They don't seem to care about this at all. They're very cold to this. They don't seem to be in grief about this person. The music kind of leans into that. It is darker, sure, but mournful? Depressed? No, the chord progression doesn't really lean too hard into that. And it kind of makes me wonder about the overwhelming thing that I understood about the black metal coming in and drowning out the vocals. That doesn't really seem to be apparent here either. This person doesn't seem to have much emotion about anything other than maybe happiness? I mean, this is going to be a stretch, but he says he got tired of being a bastard. Usually, if you call someone a bastard, you're not too keen on that person. Maybe this is a cultural thing. Maybe that's more of a term of endearment for like a buddy or something like that. Where I don't know, but I don't read it like that. And so yeah, I'm a little confused about this. For a song about these themes, it kind of doesn't hit me that way. It doesn't impact me that way. And I think a lot of it comes down to the perspective they chose to tell it through. I think there's a lot better ways to tell a story about depression and suicide and self harm than this. However, this paints a very specific picture too. And any other telling of this story would be a very different artistic endeavor. One that I think would honestly be a bit more impactful, but it'd still be different. As usual, I don't know where I was going with that. So yeah, these are my thoughts. I'm very confused about this now. What are your thoughts on Psychonaut 4's Too Late to Call an Ambulance? Uh, did you enjoy this? Is there anything that stood out to you? Anything that you'd like to add on to what I said or correct me on? Maybe you have your own interpretation of things. Put all of that and any other thoughts you have down into the comment section. I'm interested to see what other people say about this song. I thought I had a really good read on it, and the lyrics undid everything, at least from my perspective. Above the comments is the description box. Find a link to Linktree in there. Takes you here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. Alright, that wraps it up for today. I'll be back tomorrow, though, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC as usual. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.